am handing over to our moderator, Robbie Guevara, who is the president of the International Council for Adult Education. Robbie, the floor is yours.
After I mute myself, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It's 11 o'clock where I am here in Melbourne, Australia, lockdown capital of Australia, unfortunately at the moment. I welcome you all. I acknowledge that I'm on lands of the Wurundjeri people at RMIT University, and I acknowledge that these lands are unceded, and continuing occupancy is an important thing we continue to deal with. And I guess part of our discussions today on global citizenship is primarily around this idea of engaging with the issues like this. So I just want to check that I want to share my screen, and I just want to say good evening, good day to everybody who's joining us today. I have the pleasure of moderating the session, and I hope that everybody can, Ricardo, can you confirm that we can see the slides? And so today, the focus is on global citizenship education response to global crisis. It's not just one, but multiple crises. And so let me start by asking you, we're gonna put up a poll, and you've seen polls in webinars before, but I'd like to focus on something visual. Now, which of these images for you best captures global citizenship education? Okay, and so Ricardo will put up the poll, and if we can get you to respond.
Currently, nobody has participated in the poll yet.
I'm seeing a.
Not accessible.
I can't respond. Is this the answer? Can you try again, Ricardo?
Yes, I think it's not working.
That's it. That's it now. People can respond. Okay, thank you. So you can set aside the poll and you can see the images. Which images best captures global citizenship education for you? And so we'll close the poll in a few more seconds. You have numbers? I cannot see the numbers. Ricardo can see numbers.
We have 60% participating, 65.
Okay, keep going, keep going.
I will let you know when we have like 80%. So, a few more seconds.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and our survey said, okay, so 25% said A, 11% said B, 42% said C, and 22% said D. Okay, so interesting in terms of the spread. And again, it might also give our speakers a sense of what people think about global citizenship education. The first image actually comes from the Brookings Institute. It's a monitoring and evaluation tool that they've developed on global citizenship education. The second image comes from an education content that UNESCO has prepared in terms of integrating global citizenship education. The third comes from Global Education First Initiative, which was a Ban Ki-moon initiative that not first, but what was critical in getting global citizenship education in SDGs. And the last one comes from Asia, the Asia Pacific Center for Education and International Understanding. It's a UNESCO office, a UNESCO center in Korea. Okay, if you will look at all the images, there are a few things that are common. Hands, isn't it? All of it have some sort of hands, raising of hands, but different colored hands, diverse shapes, diverse colors, and diverse sizes. The second is you have globes and worlds in images of the world, but it's not just a world that's about geography, but you can see in terms of the highest one in the sea, it's a world that has different colors, not just bodies of water and land. And finally, the third is you have a diverse set of people, diverse sets of hands. You have young people, you have people of color, you have people who are differently abled, but they're all raising their hands or all active. And in a sense, these are shared elements across global citizenship. But what I'd like to see, and it's interesting in terms of the feedback from the group, if you start to look at images on the web on global citizenship education, you will see a lot of images that are children-based. Children being global citizens in schools. And what we'd like to focus on and open up today, and hence this is hosted by the International Council of Adult Education, by UNESCO Institute of Lifelong Learning, and by Bridge 47, is that global citizenship education spans the whole gamut of life. It's about lifelong learning, and particularly around adult, community, and further education, but also, of course, about schools. Hence the diversity of the images that brings us to this idea that global citizenship education is about raising our hands to commit, not just to commit, but to act, to shape the world, to uplift the world. And currently we're in a situation that is really challenging. Where does this actually come from? Okay, so today we will have different views, as I said, of our co-hosts in this session. Werner Mauch would talk about global citizenship education from the policy perspective. Katarina Popovic, the Secretary General of ICAE, will talk about it more in terms of the concept. Where does the concept come from, and how do we actually not just embrace but challenge the concept? And really we'll talk about how do we as practitioners engage with this concept in the different contexts that we find ourselves in. But just some background, okay? If you will start to look at it, where does this idea of global citizenship education come from? It is part of the SDGs. It's part of the SDGs that was developed in 2015. It particularly is in target 4.7. And maybe that's why some of you will wonder, what's Bridge 47? Is it 47 bridges? No, it's linked to the target 4.7 in the SDGs. So that's important as a starting point. The second, in terms of where does it come from, one of the images you saw earlier was from Getty. It's critical in a sense because when Ban Ki-moon was leaving the UN, this was one of his programs that he wanted to education that is transformative is at the heart of any social, political, and development agenda. And so in that sense, that's how it got into the one of the elements of 4.7, global citizenship and education for sustainable development. But this kind of education that is transformative of development is not new. It's also been there for a long time, and particularly for people in the Western countries and NGOs. It was a term that emerged in the 70s, according to Douglas Bourne from the University Institute of Education in London. Okay, and so development education originally was part of the northern-based NGOs, the developed countries, trying to raise public awareness to understand the need to support international development. So it's from the north to support the south. But I think now that has all changed. Global citizenship means it's global. Okay, it's not just from north to south, it's north to north, north to south, south to south. And this idea that there are many different interpretations of global citizenship education. And today we will give you a range of those interpretations. One of the things for me as an educator that I closely identify with global citizenship education comes from Learning the Treasure Within, which is a UNESCO report in 1996, it's more popularly called the Delors Report. It was one of the first ones that advocated for learning throughout life, but also it was one that advocated for the 4 pillars of learning: learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. This comes from an earlier report called Learning to Be, which is called the Powder Report. And if you are very much engaged with the dynamic world that we're in now, UNESCO has just started a process called the Futures of Education, where we're trying to develop a new understanding, okay, of what it means for learning to become. And so this is part of this whole discussion around global citizenship education. So just to build on the 4 pillars of education, before I hand over to our speakers, I say the 4 pillars was learning to do, learning to know, learning to be, and learning to live together. During the decade of education for sustainable development, there were proposals that we should add learning to transform oneself and society. If we are to look at it in the current crisis, in a particular focus on COVID-19, a lot of global citizenship education, or a lot of education, was first focusing on learning to know, what is the virus about? What is its effect? But what do we do about it? Hand washing, learning to be distant to each other. But most importantly, I think it's learning to stay safe and learning to stay together, or learning to live together. But this pandemic will be an opportunity only if we learn to transform ourselves and our society, because otherwise then we'll be victims of this pandemic. And so today the discussion is about not just to say how do we learn to know, to do, to be, or to live together, but how do we as citizens, as active global citizens, engage in this process of learning about global citizenship. So I'd like to welcome you again, and I'd like now to pass on the floor to good friend and colleague Werner Mauch from the UIL to share his slide and prepare and give us a policy framework. And each of us were given 10 minutes. So Werner, your 10 minutes starts. Can you share your screen? I'll stop sharing my screen. There you go. Again, please feel free to add messages to the chat. Ricardo will be monitoring the chat and gathering questions as we go along. Thanks, Werner. Are you muted?
There we go. I have it. I found the button.
Okay.
I'm heard, right?
Yes, thanks, Werner.
So thanks again then. Thank you, Robbie, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. And thanks for the organizers to let me join you and to speak to you within this session. I'm trying to shed a light on a UNESCO perspective, as Robbie has already mentioned, and we have already seen quite a substantial lot of UNESCO contributions. I would like to share with you from the perspective of UIL, the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, the perspective that will be guiding the activities we are doing. UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning is responsible at UNESCO for adult education and non-formal education, for doing research, publication, capacity building, etc. So let me start with, okay, I can't move. That's a nice surprise. I can't move with the PowerPoint.
Do you want me to share it?
Please. I had it on my screen. I had it shared, I think, but it didn't move.
Okay, so Ricardo will share. Yes.
Please,
okay.
Next slide. Next slide. Okay, no, this one. When talking about global crises, and this is in the heading of what we are talking all about, I think it is possible to distinguish 5 separate crises that are at the moment relevant for a global, from a global perspective. There might other distinctions be possible, but I would try to use these 5 ones. And at the beginning, I would start with the crisis related to poverty and hunger. We still know that hunger even increases at the moment again after some positive developments. And this crisis is related to a certain extent with, closely related with economy and societal developments. We have the global crisis of climate change that is relevant with regard to the perspective of environment and from an ecological perspective. We have a rise at number 3 in my crisis enumeration, a rise of violent extremism, so that feelings of security and peace are challenged largely through this crisis. At the same time, we have a rise of populism, which is a challenge to democracy and to the governance methods we are used to. And finally, there is the pandemic, and one of them we are experiencing at the moment quite intensively, which is a challenge to health. I made the pluses, the crosses, to show that all these crises are also related to each other. So poverty and hunger has something to do, or is even aggravated by climate change. Violent extremism and rise of populism have, relations. The pandemic is related to the feeling of security and peace. And so all the elements shown here are interconnected, which is also not new. So I do not want to pretend that these crises are isolated, and we know that they are interrelated. But at the same time, with these crises, I think the context is also described by large growth of first information and knowledge and the possibilities of exchange through ICT and social media. And we also understand that artificial intelligence is on the rise. At the same time, there is notable scientific achievements in all these fields with regard to fighting hunger and climate change, as well as pandemics. So there is achievements, and there is a huge possibility to share new concepts. And at the same time, there is a growth of inequalities and a concentration of wealth. So from this is how I would describe the background and the crises background we are in, with interrelated crises in a certain environment. So next slide, please. The first response of the global community is within this understanding that we support sustainable development with all its goals and targets. This is an attempt to address all these crises with different focuses. For instance, no poverty, the SDG #1 is addressing the first crisis I had described, and the attempt is indeed to end extreme poverty and to get an end with hunger. And although there are still bad news that the figures are rising again. SDG 1 and 2 are addressed. We also know that all the other crises are dealing in principle with one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and altogether these 17 goals are the means at hand and the possibility to address these crises. So in times of crisis, there is a promotion of sustainable development from the perspective of the international community and the UN agenda. And next slide, please. We also understand that the response to these crises from the perspective of education is global citizenship education and education for sustainable development. They are linked to each other. We from UNESCO look at them differently, but we know that both ways of education are are linked, and they have also common threats. Let's remind us that the overall goal of SDG 4 is ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Target 4.7, we will hear more about that, is focusing on global citizenship and education for sustainable development, and should help us people should learn that they are part of a bigger of a bigger whole, that there is global perspectives, and these crises are in fact interrelated. It's useless to fight crises from the perspective of a nation state, but it is necessary to use a global scope and all these crises, and they are interlinked, as I already mentioned. Altogether, they need a global response, and I suppose that you understand that global citizenship education is a means, so that people understand that there is a possibility to get an understanding of oneself in interrelated circumstances, part of a bigger community, part of a global community even, and that education for sustainable development is addressing developments that help to fight these crises from a global perspective. So the target 4.7, which also includes right-based approaches and also looking at gender disparities and tries to how to say, to help that they are no longer that severe, and is also addressing peace. And so all these targets, altogether, global citizenship education should help to fight these crises. Next slide, please. From the perspective of adult learning and education, where I just wanted to remind us that we distinguish three main fields of learning for adults. One is literacy and basic skills. The second one is professional development, addressing vocational skills. And the last one is active citizenship skills, active citizenship, which is related basically to democracy. But citizenship skills should be acquired in learning processes that help to understand that we are citizens with certain rights and the possibilities to participate in our societies. And the promotion of citizenship skills will be one of the key objectives we will have in the near future. And now I'm coming to the point how UNESCO is going to support citizenship skills, including active and global citizenship. Next slide, please. We are approaching Confintea 7, the 7th International Conference on Adult Education, which takes place in 2022, which will review the global situation of ALE in UNESCO member states, will formulate the new international agenda of adult learning and education, and agree on key activities to enhance practices, concepts of adult learning and education. And this conference is in the framework of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So adult learning and education and the World Conference will have a look at what is possible and how the ALE community positions itself in the framework of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And education for ESD and GCED will be in the focus. So on the one hand, we have sustainable development with all the goals, but we foresee already that Confintea will have a clear focus on ESD and GCED. Next slide, please. And on the way to Confintea 7, for those who know already the UNESCO background, that UNESCO is also preparing the global report on adult learning and education, and its 5th edition, GRAIL 5, will be launched in 2022. It marks which marks the end of the Confintea 7 period. And so the conference will establish a new framework for action. For adult learning and education, the Belém framework for action of 2009, BFA, has been governing the policies. It was the meta policy, which was addressing member states to promote adult learning and education appropriately, together with the UNESCO recommendation on adult learning and education, which was adopted in 2015. And the thematic focus of GRAIL 5 is citizenship education, including global citizenship education, as well as active citizenship. So all these themes that help us to understand that we are part of a community, that we have rights and have the possibility and somehow the possibility to engage in our society. And the conference will decide on a new framework for action, and GRAIL 5, this report, which is established at the moment, is trying to form the background for that. Next slide, please. So we know that citizenship education is the poor relative of the three fields. There is much focus on literacy as well as on vocational education, but citizenship education is becoming more important. We know that it needs support, is the key theme in connection with sustainable development, and it relates to human rights peace, justice, democracy. And I forgot that, to the 3 pillars of sustainable development, of course, society, economy, ecology. So sustainable development itself is also addressing the crises with the different components. And so we are looking at the one hand at active citizenship and global citizenship from these 2 perspectives, which is the perspective of the UNESCO recommendation. Next slide, please. I think we are getting close. And so from UNESCO's perspective, we will examine the relevance of citizenship education for adult learning and education and non-formal education in the perspective of the 2022 conference. We want to sensitize member states. We have just now started with the GRAIL 5 survey. And in July until September, we have several activities running with member states and with stakeholders to build their capacities in looking at the situation of adult learning and education in their in their levels and in their countries. And we will also see a series of regional preparatory conferences in 2022 that also will, from a regional perspective, try to grasp the relevance of global citizenship education, active citizenship, and citizenship education as a whole, leading us to when we all meet then in 2022 in Morocco for the next Confintea, for Confintea 7. And that's where I am, where I, so far, my overview, how we think from UNESCO's perspective, why global citizenship education will be of prior importance and how we think that member states could play a role in supporting that and why with regard to addressing all these crises. Thank you.
Oh, catch your breath, Werner. Thank you. Okay, so yes, so thanks, Werner. So for those who've joined us just now, welcome. And so Werner's just given us an overview in terms of the policy perspective, how UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning focuses on and why they've decided to focus on global citizenship education as part of this next round of discussion of Confintea 7 rather. Okay, and so from that policy, the broad policy perspective that actually helped us understand the nature of the crisis. Okay, and the nature of understanding the crisis is part of learning. But it's not just a part of learning what the concept is. What Katarina now takes us through is why. Why is global citizenship important? What are the underpinnings of where global citizenship education comes from, and why is it important for us as both civil society partners, but also of people, of educators in general, to engage with this critical topics. So I'd like to invite Katarina for your 10 minutes of input on global citizenship education and the whole idea around the concept of global citizenship education. Please feel free to share your slides. Thanks, Katarina.
Thank you very much, Robbie, and welcome to all participants. I'm unmuted now, and I will share the screen. Okay, so just a confirmation, it works technically. Can I go on?
It works.
Thank you. So I have a very simple structure of the presentation. There are 3 slides and a picture to each of them. And as Robbie said, I will go to the more reality of the life and reality of the context where global citizenship education should work and act in the times of crisis. So I see global citizenship education as a powerful tool. You might think it's maybe an exaggeration, but I'll try to convince you that it is indeed parallel to health education and other educational sectors. This is equally important. So I have structured presentation in the 3 aspects. We have a syntagma, global citizenship education. First one would be about the global, second one about citizenship, and third one about education. So what are the global aspects and why are they so important in education in the times of crisis? So I created a small list. It could be even longer, but my main arguments are that in the times of crisis, global crisis, being it health or some other, it's very important that we have a kind of education that will raise awareness of the people about the global issues. And some of them are anthropogenic climate change, because of course, Now we have COVID crisis, but the other one could be a tsunami or another one. Anyway, where people do have an impact. Then we also need to raise awareness about what's going on in another part of the world in terms of environmental degradation. Of course, this is something which is important per se, but this could also cause or encourage the spread of new diseases. And then I mentioned here a few: large-scale deforestation, habitat degradation and fragmentation, agriculture intensification, trading species and plants, and that was important in context of a COVID crisis, eating habits as well, and so on. So we cannot sit in our small corner of the world and simply not be aware of what's going on there, because this crisis did show us this will come to us. We are sitting in the same boat. I will come to this later. So the next point is being aware about the others. And I put others like, other people, other groups, other countries, other regions. And being aware of their reality in the times of crisis, especially about their life and work. For example, what does it mean? Sorry, it's duplicated here. What does it mean, the recommendation in the times of crisis to keep physical distance and to work at home? And you will all remember, I'm sure, this nice hashtag, stay at home, stay at home. So is it really possible for many people around the globe to stay at home? Is it possible, can they allow themselves a luxury of working from home? We shouldn't forget that for millions of people around the globe, there is a high risk of unemployment and they might lose their livelihoods. So think of India or other big countries where people they earn their daily living in going out. So physical, or also where the living conditions are so bad that people cannot really follow those physical distances rule, although if they would like to. So this is something that global citizenship education could help us to understand, that our small reality in our small part of the world is not the reality for millions of people around the globe. And of course, this increased digital gap, all those webinars and the Zoom platforms and other platforms that we are happy to enjoy now, this is not the reality for half of the world. Half of the world is not online. They are even more excluded now than they used to be. So this is the global reality, and that's what global citizenship education is teaching us also. And another aspect which I consider also very important is that for many countries, it means also closing borders. That's what we have experienced not only in Europe, but in many other countries as well, which also means at the same time that we can lose this sense of global citizenship, sense of global solidarity. We face increased nationalism and hate towards the others. And this can jeopardize very much what we have already achieved in this sense of global citizenship. And that's what global citizenship education should keep teaching us, how important this global feeling is. So these are a few of the most important global aspects. Now I will move to this, sorry, I said a photo or a picture to all. This is in a time of lockdown in India, Panta in India. So telling these people social distances and wearing masks and working from home sounds cynical, not only for them, as I said, for millions of people around the globe. So I moved to this civic or citizenship component of global citizenship education. And I believe this is as important as health education. Again, you might think it's exaggeration, but I believe if you check not only Europe, although it was very important for Europe as well, but also for many other countries, keyword Brazil, for example, among the big countries, who say that pandemic, COVID pandemic, and that's not the first one, not the first catastrophe that misused the situation, pandemic could easily serve to justify exclusion of certain groups, punishment, stigmatization, harassment based on political, radical, religious biases, and unnecessary distances among the groups, social, economic, and so on. What we face is especially decreased position or role of situation of worsening of situation of women, older people, and migrants. There are already numerous reports showing that domestic violence has increased, the violence against girl and woman. The older people are in the group of those who are mostly harmed by the measures introduced by the governments. They were under the lockdown. For example, in Serbia, they were under the complete lockdown for a whole month without any support by government, any help, systematic help, providing food or anything. In the next month, they were allowed to go out to buy food 4 o'clock in the morning, not allowed to go for a walk, to leave the house not for a minute, punished, very harsh punishment, the amounts that they could not pay and so on. And of course, migrants, they do belong especially to the vulnerable groups, and especially in times where this xenophobia is increased. So citizenship education should make us aware that it's not our task to take care only about ourselves and to take measures that will protect us and our families, but also the vulnerable groups, that because they are under the threat more than in the times without the crisis. Pandemic generally can increase social inequalities among the countries, but also within the countries. And as I said, again, double, sorry, these three groups that are of special importance as especially vulnerable ones. Global citizenship education could also and should also raise awareness and share information about the need that to respect the human rights during the pandemic. Many authoritarian governments use and misuse the pandemic as an excuse to cut the human rights and to increase the level of authoritarianism in certain countries. Brazil and Serbia or Hungary are among of those countries, but there are plenty others, as you know. And why is it important? Many people, because of the fear and the emotional state they are in because of the pandemic, they tend to forget, even people who are open-minded and educated democratic, they tend to forget that human rights should be respected in all the times. And if there are limits, there are certain rules how you can limit the human rights. What are the procedures for that? What are the rules? So people need to be thought about that. Also, the participation in democratic processes and in the decision making. So it's not like it was the case in Serbia when one man, and only one man, and of course it's a president, decided about lockdown measures, how long and which social groups and so on. So there is a level of participation that should be enabled all the time, and people need to be aware of that. Of course, phenomena like nationalism and xenophobia and isolation and so on, these are also, they increase usually in the times of pandemic. And this is something that global citizenship education should be teaching people and making them aware of. Also, what are the mechanisms to help defend civic rights, freedom of speech, and freedom of media reporting, because they are extremely under the threat during the crisis. And here I have an illustration. It was just 3 days ago in Serbia, we were protesting against the way that authoritarian regime was handling the pandemic. And this was the brutal reaction of the police against the Serbian citizens. So that's the reason why I say sometimes global citizenship education is as important as health education in the times of crisis. And finally, I focus on the last word, which is the education in this syntagma. And this is, well, the usual task, but in the times of crisis, what is of special importance? So there are three types of three areas of education and learning. First one is, well, we hear it all the time. Education should provide skills, for example, teaching new behavior and skills about how to do the disinfection, how to treat the food, how to protect yourself. Of course, very important digital skills and other skills that help people to cope with the crisis. New vocational skills to deal with an unemployment that will arise during the crisis, but also after the crisis. So this is the first level. Second level is, well, broader knowledge. We were all learning about the broader issues like health and viruses and widespread of viruses, biology, medicine. also things like mental health and how to cope with the stress, and about mental and emotional stability, how to cope with uncertainty. We were dealing, as I said, with the political issues and democracy and human rights and the rules of democracy. But we were also learning the new areas and dealing with the culture or reading or music, those who had time to do that. But there is a free type of the education, and that will be at the end my most important message. This is the transformative education and learning, and this is something we need in order to prevent future crises, or at least to reduce their harmful impact. This is about rethinking the old normal. I said we are all sitting in the same boat, but I will add, and that's what I keep quoting these days, the famous poem, we are not in the same storm. And we see that we are hit by crises in a very different ways in different parts of the world. Why it is the case? What are the systemic and structural injustice and inequalities and the power structures behind the systems we live in that cause that some people are really suffering because of the crisis, and for others it's just a moment of reflection and kind of a luxus. So the transformative learning and education should keep us reflecting on those inequalities, justice, and should inspire the change and create the new normal that will be much better than the old one. And this is the photo that should symbolize the transformative learning and education, that this new crisis should push us to improve more. And this is one of the tasks of the global citizenship education. Thank you. Robbie, over to you.
Thank you, Katarina. Spot on. So yeah, thank you for sharing the idea of the challenge around the whole idea of understanding. But it's not just awareness and understanding, but the link that all these understandings are also about positioning yourself in terms of the other, but not separating yourself from the other, but also living with that in terms of recognition of rights. But this whole idea, it's not just about understanding, not just the knowledge, not just the skill, but the purpose to transform. And so with that purpose to transform, I'd like to invite Rilli in terms of your purpose to transform practice, your purpose to transform and contextualize practice in the work that you do with Bridge 47. Thanks, Rilli. You have your 10 minutes.
Thank you. And can I invite Ricardo to put the PowerPoint just to make it sure that it will work? That could be helpful. Yeah. Thanks a lot. And perhaps I could just starting to say a couple of words about the Bridge 47, which might be not known by everybody. So the Bridge 47, it's a network mainly for the civil society organizations, but we do have quite a lot of researchers and colleagues, even civil servants, in the global level. And the main point is that we want to exactly promote and use the target 4.7 to implement all those educations, the value-based educations, which are covered under the 4.7. So this is the place where we can join the forces. And how we do that is that the network itself, it's a place for us where we can really learn from each other. You can even do the cooperation or whatever you want to use that in the best way. But also we do quite a lot of advocacy. And I will give you in a minute an example about that, what we have done during the last decade, half a year on that. We also promote and facilitate the partnerships. So we're trying to build connections between different actors so we can really find some kind of new innovations, which is the fourth area, what we do. So trying to find out about the good examples, how we can really implement the global citizenship education in many ways. And with these elements, the whole point is that we are trying to implement and make it back to the practice about this transformative change. We have heard this word several times already, but I think that we need to also find the practical ways how you do that, which I think that it's absolutely one of the key tools for the future for all of us at the moment. But perhaps I could move on now on explaining a little bit more concretely and using the outcomes and the results of the event what we organized last November in Helsinki. It was under the Finnish European Union presidency program, where we brought together around 200 people representing practitioners, civil servants, academics, civil society, and then really thinking that what we should concretely do, and we took European Union as a target because we mainly believe that exactly there is a lot of structures which could exactly help us to move on in the EU level, and if we can start from there, we can also use about these methodologies and examples also on the other regions. And I'm just now going quickly through about the main outcomes, what we collectively elaborated. We had 6 different groupings of the chapters, or we worked through the 2 days in specific working groups. And perhaps I could quickly go through all of those so you can get a little bit taste on that, what we agreed. So starting with this transformative education for target 4.7 is that, like Werner and Katarina mentioned, exactly the systematic change is absolutely needed. But we need to do that in the 2 levels. We need to really take account about the structures, the existing system, what we're having in the world, but also we need to work in the personal individual level. It's not either or, it's a both. We need the both levels because anyway, the individuals are those who are using the systems and the structures. And then we need to mobilize about the people to be motivated also to challenge about the current structures. And also we shouldn't really jump automatically to the results, but the process itself extremely important, especially when we are really talking about a sustainable change. It won't really happen in one night. It really takes time to really get everybody on and really getting everybody participated and really taking the results as existing methodologies. Then the next one, we talk quite a lot on the formal, non-formal and informal education. And I think that all of those are absolutely necessary. Of course, also linking those to the lifelong learning. And then like we all know that in the current life, the first professional career, what you started in your not childhood, but as a young adult, it won't really stay. So you need to really learn how to live, but how to really have your situation in the life in many ways. You need to really accommodate that in the different situations. And I think that there's a huge potential making the bridges between all those 3 educations. Then the third one, what we discussed was the cross-sectoral cooperation. And that was one of the points that none of us representing one organization, either the civil society or the government or United Nations or private sector or academics, none of us alone can really make this change. And that's why we need to really seriously find the ways how we can really work together. And that really means that we need to trust the other ones. We need to really build opportunities, and then we need to take time on that we can really find the common goals and building the trust, and that is the basis for the transformative change. Then the next one is the indicators, and like we all know that what gets measured gets implemented, and we can't really avoid about that what are the indicators, how we are measuring about the 4.7 as well. And that's why it's very, very important to take that aspect also when we are talking about the implementation of the 4.7 and how we can really, really challenge that, because the current indicator at the moment is heavily focused on the formal education. Absolutely important, but it's not the full picture. And then I think the last one, last topic what we discussed, no, it wasn't the last one. There are two. If you can, Ricardo, go one back. Yes, the competencies. I think many of us has heard about several times about these competencies and how exactly everything is measured by the competencies. But it's not just for the competencies for being the good worker or good voter when the elections comes, but it's really learning to be the active citizens. I think that's really is the full picture on all that we need to really see the competencies in a much wider perspective, really including again the implementation of all forms of the learning, and really this pre and in-service training for the educations, developing a formal sector curricula. So there's a lot of aspects on that. And then the last one is about the resources. And definitely this is the big thing as well. The good thing on the discussions, what happened was that it's not just about the money. Of course, the funding plays a big role on that, but I think that it's too lazy to just to think about the funding, because there's a lot of human capital what we can really use, what we can really, the question is that how we can get best out of the potential what the people have. And in that case, the adequate funding, the technology can really help us as well. But it's really a lot of social capital, but I think that we should really keep in mind and really building the bridges, building the networks, bringing the people together, innovation, and really creating together about the solutions. That could be one of the outcomes for us, how we can move on. So these are just for the reflections, what we found out. And just to let you know that we are working at the moment, making the more concrete advocacy plans, especially in the European Union level. But of course, happy to share that. And I definitely believe that there's a lot of elements what any of us also use on the other continents, and not just in the continent level, but also in the local or national level, including also the global level, working with the UNESCO, which is our partner on operating and working with that. So I think that these might be the inspirations for you as well, to really think about that, how we are all those important points mentioned by Werner and Katarina, how we could really put those also in back to the practice. So thanks a lot.
Thanks really very much for your contribution that looks at it, not just to highlight the role of the individual, not just of the system, to highlight the different learnings in terms of the formal, non-formal, and informal learning, but also to highlight the value of partnerships. But also, similar to Katarina, how do we bring in transformation? How do you transform how we measure global citizenship? How do we actually transform the kinds of relationships to make us active citizens? There were four questions that I managed to get. There's one that just came on. But what I'd like to do is I'm going to share my screen, and I've classified the first 4 questions that came in. And I'd like to direct them, because we have a few minutes left. The first set to particular speakers. The first question was around the whole concept of citizenship. And I know Katarina already responded to this online, but this whole idea that most citizenship is focused on the legal aspect, the passport, I'm a citizen, okay? How does global citizenship actually overcome that? I'd like Katarina to respond to that. The second question is around the whole idea of education, and I'd like to direct that to Werner, in the sense that what the pandemic has exposed us to is that the education itself has revealed a crisis of the inequalities, so particularly the issue of access. So how do we address these inequalities while building global citizenship education? And the last 2 questions are about the action, and I'd like to address Rilli and the others to be able to say, is global citizenship therefore the vaccine? Is it the treatment to the crisis? And what is the role of voluntarism, and how can we go beyond voluntarism? And maybe that's something we can look at towards the end. But I'd like to, this first 4 sets of questions, Katarina, Werner, and Rilli, and then I'll pick up some of the other questions that are just coming in. Can we ask you, Katarina, to respond?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Now I'm combining, have some technical problems, and I'm on another computer, but as long as it works, it's fine. So I think it's an extremely important question, and this crisis did offer a kind of an answer. So citizenship is not a formal thing or a passport. And there is increased change understanding, but the problem is it was supported by a fettered free market logic. You know, we need now another kind of globalization, one that will be supported by this, how should I say it, by belonging to the humanity logic, and the logic that would enable us really to feel like part of the world, connected to other people and not part of the global market or the global labor force. So we need to shift more to and push more for the global citizenship that is based on another kind of understanding. And if you would allow me, I will connect it to Daniel's question of multiple crises. And I think that's exactly the point. Like these crises, multiple crises, are symptom of one disease. And well, it's a very complex one. But this is this complex architecture, financial, economic, social, political architecture, full of inequalities, full of injustice and unfair trade, as I said, that supported also the globalization. So addressing these structural issues and going for a new understanding of globalization, a new logic of globalization, a new understanding of global citizenship might help us to cure the main disease or the set of diseases and to look more optimistic to the future crisis.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
and
thanks.
that relates to one of the questions, Katarina. Maybe later on you can reflect on this idea that how can we engage this when autocratic governments don't want us to be active citizens?
Yeah, yes. That's a very important one, and that's what we do all the time. The photos you saw that I showed you from Serbia, that's exactly what I'm doing currently these days. You know, if there are no peaceful ways, then you organize civic protests. But this is the final mean, and I hope there are many others that could be tried by people and citizens in other countries. So I wouldn't recommend to use this one unless you have.
Thank you, Katarina. Really, I know you have to go soon. So Werner, I'm going to ask Rilli first to respond to this whole idea. Do you think global citizenship education is the vaccine, is the treatment for the underlying disease? And what is your experience of engaging voluntarism in this process of global citizenship? You're muted, Rilli.
Happens always. Yes, indeed. I definitely believe that the 4.7, I don't really believe that even without the 4.7, we can never implement about all the SDGs. I think that it's somehow we need to really have a much more knowledge, much more awareness raising about the interlinkages about the global topics. So in that way, I believe definitely that it is the treatment on that. So it's absolutely fundamental essence for all of that. And I think it's also the question about building the bridges and understanding about the coherences, interlinkages between the topics. So in that way, through the global citizenship education, we can make it more visible as well about what is the reality where we're living at the moment. And also giving the examples about the incoherencies. Like in theory, we have the Human Rights Declaration, but what is the implementation on that? As one example, there's several other examples. Then about this voluntarism, I think it's absolutely fundamentally important. But I would really come back on my comment earlier on that we need the both tracks. We need to insist about the current situation in the structures, in the policies. We need to use those paths. We need to really use those tracks and then really change the policies in that way that it's really in the implementation take account about the realities and then really walk the talk on that way. But then on the other side, we need the active citizens, for example, as volunteers, to really play their own role, where the majority of those people, they are super motivated to promote about the values and the work that they're doing as a volunteers. So it's huge potential using this expertise, these resources, these motivations, and channeling that in the right directions. But I think we need the both, and that's why I think that we need to get several and different actors involved on the process that we can really make the change happening. I'm extremely sorry, I need to now run to the next one, but thanks all for
Thank you very much, Rilli. Can we give Rilli a round of applause? Okay, Werner. it's your turn. Back in your policy hat, working with UIL and working in UNESCO, this whole idea of access to education is very important. So how do we deal with the underlying thing? So it's not just the crisis, but in terms of education, in the context of education, okay, the inequalities that have surfaced. How do we therefore engage with global citizenship given this context? Werner?
Thank you, Robbie. Yeah, on the one hand, I think the crisis itself fuels discourse and somehow provokes discussion, and more thought and more activity around thought takes place. So all that is part of learning and of education. So I think we can certainly see that the crises themselves are also factors of enabling discourse and of enabling learning on the one hand. We also see that the crisis, the corona crisis, has helped us to use specific means more and perhaps even better than we did before. We are much more used to such possibilities of exchange of discourse we are now in. And this is a result of the crisis on the one hand, but you are absolutely right. This is a kind of global community is dependent from global access. And so it is necessary that those who want to have a voice need to have the possibility to speak up. And on the one hand, the new technologies help that wider communities emerge, that larger discussions go on and can be led, but on the other hand, it also is visible that just giving access is not always helpful. People are meanwhile much more used to speak up freely without any inhibition, and so giving just everybody access to the possibilities and to the means of being heard is also not without problems. But on the other hand, I think it goes without saying that the fight for giving access to education, and rightly understood education, to learning processes that are helpful so that people can address their own, how to say, projects, and such as access still needs to be promoted. And those who do not or are restricted in access possibilities deserve our solidarity. And the fight for universal free education at all ages as far as possible is certainly continuing. And we can look forward, to my understanding, how that continues, and that access to education and learning is enabled, especially to those who are the most disadvantaged and need it most. But this takes place in a kind of market situation, in a global market. And so there are many factors dealing with that. From the perspective of UNESCO, however, those who need access to education should get support to getting it. So that's brought to the point without looking into the margins too closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know it's 5 past the time that we're supposed to finish, and we've had some people leave the room. There are 2 more things that I think before we wind up, and last words. This is part of the question around, so what kind of education is the good education that challenges the negative conflictual information? And Thomas Kwan from Singapore asks, what kind of education and learning ensures earning at this time? I'd like to ask Werner and Katarina, any thoughts about what kind of education, therefore, it's not just good in the terms of it's against the conflictual, but also good in terms of well-being, but also in terms of the economics of it. So some last thoughts around, as you said, Werner, linking the social, the economic, and the environment and the political all together in terms of active citizenship. So I'll start with Werner, then Katarina, and then I'll formally close. Thanks for those who are staying on.
Well, there is never a guarantee that the right education leads to the right earning. That's somehow an ongoing question. What kind of skills do I need to remain a force in market conditions? And so this will continue. And somehow, from my understanding, the right education is the one that fits to the specific needs, and that the education that helps to enhance capacities to act of actors is the right education. And not only in the market, but the market success will follow the empowerment understanding. And so learning to do what I need to do and to be successful and enlarging my own capacities to act will be one of the key things that will also help to success on markets, including the labor market, and and inequalities will also remain, but having the possibilities to have a voice in a market situation and having learned that appropriately, I think it goes along these lines. This is what I would say briefly to answer that. Thank you.
Katarina, last words for you.
From me, well, just a few points. Werner mentioned already education that fits the needs of the individuals or groups. This is an important issue, but there is another one. We are talking a lot about skills and talking about how it can help older citizens. Of course, skills are needed, and lifelong learning that is really lifelong, meaning no one is excluded, no age, and we see a lot of ageism also in the way we treat implementation of sustainable development goals and access to education, which is, the older you are, the less chances you have, and it starts quite early. So it should be really lifelong, and it should be fitting the needs of the person, but it should go beyond skills, and that's the most important thing. It should include knowledge as well, and I would say also values. And this is the answer to the previous question about what kind of education and how do we deal with this, all this propaganda and the fake news and so on. Critical thinking, open-mindedness, and that's what is the task of global citizen education, but I would say that's the task of any education. If you don't go by this, if you don't go beyond the skills, it will be pure drill or training. So we need critical thinking, and this crisis did show us how important it is. All those fake news, conspiracy theories. So people need to be able to deal with this critically, to examine the sources, but also to examine, be critical towards the policy of the governments, to see if they are participatory, democratic, inclusive, and so on. So good education is education that provides a combination of that, and the combination that will fit the individual and group needs.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ricarda, for hosting us, Werner and Katarina, and of course, Rilli. Thank you for all of you who were here. Just to wind up, one of the questions that was posted in the chat, and I apologize for the last two comments, and Werner might be able to respond to the question on UNESCO and the Council of Europe, is who are the leaders, therefore, of the future? And I'm saying, I showed you this diagram of learning to do, to know, to be, to live together, to transform. It's like we're waiting to become the leaders. What I'm saying is, no, global citizenship is learning through global citizenship. We need to be active now. We cannot wait to become and learn to become global citizens. We are global citizens. Your presence here today is an assurance that you are interested. You're interested, you have an awareness, you want to build on that awareness. And so hopefully our speakers today have shown that there are different platforms for global citizenship: awareness, understanding, and action. And it's the action component that is about transformation. It transforms who we are as individuals. As Rilli said, it transforms the system we find ourselves in, but hopefully it transforms the education system. Okay, because the education system, I remind, it's not just about schooling, it's about lifelong learning. And with those messages, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for staying on. I apologize for the extra time, but I think the questions were so engaging, the presentations were so dynamic, and therefore you challenged us. And so I'd like to say thank you again to our co-hosts, the UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, Bridge 47, and on behalf of the International Council of Adult Education, as the president, I'd like to say thank you for engaging with us in this high-level political forum side event. Stay safe, stay connected, take care, but also take action to shape the world we want to be through global citizenship education. From the Philippines, I also say maraming salamat, good night, good morning, good evening, everyone, and so have a good rest of the day and have a meaningful HLPF for those who are continuing to engage in the other events. Maraming salamat po. Thank you.
Thank you, Robbie.